Hi again then guys, and welcome to episode 52 of Days Gone By, the review series for Gran Turismo's vintage cars, classic cars, basically old vehicles. Now this particular vehicle is a much older car as far as this series goes. It's not quite a vintage car, but it is certainly a classic. It's the 1965 birth, if you will, of the Nissan Silvia Legacy. This is a car which, well, it's had just that, a legacy. It's hugely popular. And over the decades, it's gone through a number of major changes. The essential idea of the Silvia has never really changed in essence. It's always been a speciality coupe vehicle, but some of the details in there have changed here and there, such as notably, for instance, with the 240 RS version, which is still that speciality coupe, but went more for rallying rather than being a road car, which is more what the other Silvias tend to be. Then, of course, in later years, the Silvia, basically from the S13 onwards in particular, became really widely loved in the JDM category and as a drift car in general. Not hard to see why. It's well balanced, rear-wheel drive, essentially acting as a more playful, younger sibling of the GTR. Now, this particular vehicle, way back in the day, still had that essence to it. Or not still had, but actually originated that. This was very much so a speciality car, and interestingly, and you can actually find out this information under the information section in the game about the car, that this car was not a success, commercially speaking, because Japan is very much so an automotive world based around practicality and the usability of a car and the restrictions in size inherent to vehicles that they have to produce. Now, as such, especially back in the day, this car was not necessarily doomed to failure from the start, but it just didn't really have that great a chance of doing well. It was extremely expensive at the time, and it just didn't sell that well. They didn't make a huge amount of them, and by today's standards, in stock form at least, it doesn't really sound like that impressive a car. Around 80 horsepower, just under 90 really, and really? Is that a speciality car? Surely not. These days that's just like a small hatchback. Well, back then, that was a much bigger deal than now. This was really a pure sports car back then. Now, it didn't have the sheer power, of course, of some of the European or American cars, but Japan has never really gone for that kind of sheer power. They tend to go for more of a combination of power and low weight, in a similar way to some British sports cars like Marcos and Lotus. And just like with marques like Lotus and Marcos, it works for them. Now with this car, it really works. In real life, there are probably hardly any, if any, modified examples of this car. And that's one of the great things about Gran Turismo. And this is a slight side point, but I think it's important to bring it up, because I will often say things about the Gran Turismo franchise that some fans may not like. That being said, there are a lot of great things about the franchise, and one of the things that's easy to take for granted, not just with Gran Turismo but with other games as well, but of course in particular with GT on this occasion, is that it allows us to have access to cars which you'd never be able to drive, and certainly never be allowed to tune. Not just the obvious stuff like exotic cars, but also just cars which you wouldn't want to tune in real life, because it would ruin the car, it would ruin the pedigree, the history that the car has. This is a perfect example of that. You would never upgrade a car like this in the way that we do in the game. And that's why we have it in the game, so that you can do things like that. It's taking theory and applying it to reality. That's very cool that it allows us to do that. Now, in the case of this car, you're not working with huge numbers initially. We already said it's got around 90 horsepower. It's only a 45 grand car, which is pretty good for a highly collectible vehicle. It's one of the most important Japanese classic sports vehicles, and it's a pretty good shoe-in for maybe drivers who don't have as much experience or as much cash to get their foot into the classic market and maybe find out if it's something that appeals to them. Now, the engine is a 1.6 turbo, it's rear-wheel drive. Thankfully, that would have really hindered it, I think, if it wasn't rear-wheel drive. And fully tuned, you're looking at 288 horsepower, 231 foot-pounds of torque, and a total weight, with the full weight loss package, of course, of only 857 kilos. So to put that all into perspective, it weighs a little bit more than a Toyota Minolta Group C car. That's pretty good. The power is more than, say, an RX-7, a modern FD RX-7 that is, in stock form of course. The torque is actually very impressive for a smaller classic engine, and the engine itself is just good in general in this car, I would say. The numbers that it's putting out with tuning, highly theoretical tuning of course, is pretty good. Classic cars, even other Nissans as a perfect example, like the Prince Skyline, this is more powerful than that car, and I absolutely love the Prince BLR-A3 Skyline. It's one of my favourite, if not my favourite, classic cruising cars in the game. Now, with such a low curb weight combined with decent power, not amazing power but decent, you're looking at 336 horsepower per tonne. That's basically, say, mid-level hot hatch territory or some smaller sports cars, so that's pretty good and appropriate to the vehicle. And thankfully, the PP on this car, despite the power and weight combination, isn't too high. It only sits at 479. So potentially, this could be a useful car for, say, seasonal events, time trials, lower PP level racing, that kind of thing. In a straight line, it's not overly quick, to be honest. In fact, sometimes it can feel sluggish due to the fact that it has less power than many of the other classics, even some of the other Japanese classics. But by far the best thing about the CSP311 Silvia is the handling. This car is a joy to drive. I cannot stress that enough. I would say this is one of the most enjoyable cars in the game purely for handling, purely for its cornering ability. It's easy to drive, you've got just enough power to get the job done, but not so much that it's fighting against you. The grip is incredible, of course depending on tyres and tuning. But overall, I would say it's a car which comes together very well, and it's certainly worth checking out for a classic collector. But that's it for this pick overall. I'll see you guys next time, and as always, thanks for watching.